Good morning, Pasadena Unified School District. It is an absolute honor and one of my deepest professional pleasures to have this distinct opportunity to have been invited to deliver this back-to-school keynote address. I want to thank Dr. McDonald, the Board of Education, and all the administrators of this district who have made this bold decision to center educator and child-serving professional well-being and healing-centered mindset as the centerpiece and the core foundation of providing effective and healing-centered education for our youth in this city. I am Dr. Niki Elliott, and I serve as a clinical professor of education at the University of La Verne. I'm the director of the Center for Neurodiversity, Learning, and Wellness. And over the past 5 years in the Lefebvre College of Education, we have really centered looking at what it takes to help students, especially those with special education diagnoses, especially those with emotional disturbance diagnoses and other mood and learning challenges, what it takes for them to thrive, not just survive, but to thrive in public education. We've looked at academic standards and curriculum changes and environmental changes, and yet as we move through districts, providing support and conducting research and observing, we keep coming back to this central foundational understanding that teacher mindset, teacher well-being, and the quality of relationships that are taking place in classrooms, especially during tumultuous times similar to what we're facing in this pandemic, are central to student success and student well-being. And so I'm so honored to be with you today to talk about what it is that is required from us as child-serving professionals for providing the level of self-care and the groundedness within our being that allows us to be that kind of healing presence that not only supports the thriving of children with special needs, but for children who face identity threats, exposure to bias, children who are facing significant sorrow and sense of loss through this pandemic, as well as students who are struggling with learning as a general experience in school. I am thrilled to share with you a little bit of what I've learned in my work as an educator, and primarily through my personal experience. As I work with training teachers in school districts across the state, I'm often asked, Dr. Niki, what made you so passionate about introducing mind-body practices, yoga, mindfulness, clinical breath work, and other embodiment practices into your work with training teachers? And that grows out of a deeply personal and transformative experience that I had. Almost 20 years ago, I experienced a deeply traumatic life shock. And as a result of that, I experienced what my care providers termed nervous system dysregulation. And for me, a lot of that experience led to heightened sensitivity of sound and light and touch. It made it very difficult for me to enjoy being in crowds. And even to the point where being in the classroom with children, the normal sounds of children's laughter and the normal movement of desks and chairs and the normal scratching on chalkboards and whiteboards was overwhelming to me, to the point where I was not able to show up as my best in the classroom with youth or at home with toddlers at the time. And so my personal journey with my care providers led me on a journey toward understanding the value of yoga and the scientific evidence-based clinical breathwork practices that helped me calm and ground and kind of rebalance and reset my nervous system over a period of time. And as I became more confident in those practices and eventually became certified to teach in those practices, I began to bring some of those techniques back into schools and found that they were successful in many cases of supporting children who were challenged with mood and learning and behavior issues that were not otherwise being addressed successfully in the schools. And over time, we began to share this with some of the teachers, and we found that in the classrooms where teachers also participated in the same types of mind-body regulation practices that we were offering to the children, children got better, and teachers got better. Classroom climate improved, student focus improved, and the children even began to go home and share some of those techniques with their parents and grandparents and caregivers. And there became a ripple effect of possibility and empowerment that supported the conventional types of care that they were receiving and the therapies that were also making a significant difference in their lives. And what I have become convinced about as I build out my research agenda at the University of La Verne is that by centering teacher well-being, by centering the wellness of all adults from a 360-degree perspective who come into contact with children, whether it be the parents and caregivers, the secretaries and administrators who work the front office, the cafeteria workers, the bus drivers, campus security, even the after-school program administrators, our coaches, our janitors, everyone who comes into contact with children have an impact on their brain, heart, and nervous system regulation. We're either contributing to their sense of well-being, and in this season, we're contributing to their capacity to have greater and greater resilience for overcoming the stressors that we are all facing. Because if we really consider it, many of us are experiencing this pandemic as a source of trauma or a life shock that is really challenging our capacity to show up at our best. And so as we move into this school year, I want to highly, highly encourage each and every one of you to center your sense of well-being as a central component and the biggest gift that you can offer to being a healing presence for your classroom climate, and more importantly, for your capacity to build healing, solid relationships with youth who need it most. So we have a tagline in my work in the Mindful Leaders Project: be the thermostat, not the thermometer. And it is something that I offer as a charge to each and every one of us who walk through our world as child-serving professionals. So what do I mean by be the thermostat and not the thermometer? When we as adults show up for children as a thermostat, we are committing to ground ourselves on a daily basis with the self-care practices and the communal support practices that are necessary for us to have a grounded and regulated state of being that radiates compassion, that radiates unconditional love and acceptance, that radiates a sense of felt safety that children and adults can feel when they walk into our classroom or onto our playgrounds or into any of our district buildings. There's a felt sense that others can adjust to, and their hearts and their minds and their nervous systems can settle in the presence of a strong thermostat. Conversely, when we show up as the thermometer, if the children are a little hot and rowdy and upset or angry that day, then our energy goes to hot, rowdy, upset, angry, dysregulated. If we're a thermometer and people happen to be calm that day, then we're able to match that and be calm. But as leaders, as mindful educators, it's not our job to adjust to the temperature that's being set around us. It's our charge to set a temperature that is insightful, a temperature that is welcoming, a temperature that creates space for risk and primarily for healing-centered engagement, which is what we all need more than ever in order to access successful states of learning during this challenging time. Over the past 20 years, as I was able to successfully utilize these mind-body practices that I teach in my work to not only calm and regulate and settle my own nervous system, increase my own sense of resilience and capacity to handle large, boisterous crowds of children, manage the sounds of daily life, and really feel settled in my ability to create a sense of felt safety for others as an instructor, I began to want to make that connection, understand what's a little bit about the science of why did these yoga practices help my nervous system change and help me feel calm in crowds? Why did the breathwork practices make a difference? And so I went on a journey to really begin to understand what happens in our brain, in our hearts, and in our nervous systems that pull us out of survival mode and into a state of positive, grounded settledness and social engagement. And the theory that really helped me most was coming into an understanding of something called polyvagal theory by Stephen Porges. And what I learned in that work and what I now teach when I'm helping explain to teachers why our presence is the foundational requirement for a successful classroom climate, student achievement, and well-being And one thing that I learned that really stuck with me and that I hope to share with you today is this understanding that through a process called neuroception, our nervous systems are constantly scanning our environment at all times, asking three fundamental questions. Am I safe? Do they like me? And am I good enough to belong here? And when the answer is yes, we can assess a sense of felt safety, remembering that felt safety is different from physical safety. So as educators and school administrators, we're used to providing a sense of physical safety. Have the backpacks been checked for weapons? Have the, what do we want to say? Have the shelves been bolted to the wall for earthquake safety? Are the electrical wires out of the way? Are the windows secure? But what's more important than physical safety, as it pertains to student well-being and student achievement, is this sense of psychological safety and felt safety. So when they ask, am I safe? Do they like me? Am I good enough to belong here? This is a really important thing for us to consider, because when we are grounded in our presence, we're able to unconditionally send that signal of safety. Particularly true for students from identity groups that are expecting and have been used to historical marginalization in the school space. Our students with special ed diagnoses, our students of color, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, students from minoritized religious groups, and especially students from our LGBTQ+ communities. Many times they are moving through academic spaces where school, for many of them, is a traumatic experience because they don't feel safe. They may not feel liked or respected. They may consistently receive cues from the environment that say, you're not safe here, we don't like you, and you're not good enough to belong here. And so with that lack of psychological safety, the polyvagal theory tells us that when we are triggered into survival mode, we're out of the higher order thinking of our brain that allows us to engage in impulse control and positive bonding and social engagement, and most importantly for our purposes, having parts of the brain online that make us available to higher order thinking and memory consolidation and executive functioning. And so it is up to us as educators to be grounded enough in our presence, to be aware of our biases, to be aware of where we are triggered in our own nervous systems so that we can communicate more effectively a sense of safety, a sense of respect and dignity, and a sense of belonging to every student. So in the polyvagal theory, we see that when we feel socially connected, liked, respected, and cared for, we feel our environment is both physically and psychologically safe for us, we're able to function in our nervous systems out of this green zone, where the body is triggered into rest and digest, the parasympathetic mode. We can build relationships, and the body can heal and reset, build immunity, reduce inflammation. We're able to establish trust and intimacy. Our thinking can be more creative and intuitive. The mind is better able to focus clearly and is better positioned to learn. But if you look at this chart for yourselves, and if you can think about in your own life as an adult, what happens to your nervous system when the answer is no? I don't feel safe. I don't feel liked. I don't feel good enough to belong. Some of us are mobilized here in the red zone, as you see, that sympathetic fight or flight response. We can see this in ourselves, and we can see it in children. We feel a heightened sense of stress and anxiety. We can be mobilized with fear, being more physically aggressive, more verbally aggressive, less patient, more hypervigilant, and a greater sense of overwhelm. And for some of us, the things that we've experienced and been through in this last 18 months have kept our nervous system potentially constantly triggered in survival mode. It's important that we address that and find holistic ways, in addition to seeking conventional licensed support from a mental health professional or a spiritual counselor, to do the work that's necessary on our part to get ourselves out of this survival mode and into that green space for working with children. Perhaps you're someone who goes into the blue zone and shuts down and freezes when you're under deep pressure or stress. You might find yourself withdrawn or immobilized with fear, feelings of depression or hopelessness, a lack of energy or focus. And we see that in some of our students when they assess in an environment that there is no neuroception of safety for them. It might be a sense of hopelessness. No matter what I do, it won't make a difference. And so they disconnect and disengage from the learning process. And it's also important to recognize this purple zone, which is kind of like the combination of being mobilized to want to defend or protect the self, but then feeling shut down to freeze, to withhold or inhibit that preferred response. Because when we appease, we perceive a significant power differential between us and the person that we perceive as providing a sense of real or perceived threat, whether that's the teacher or a police officer, campus security. When we face microaggressions, racial or other types of identity threats, we sometimes find ourselves fawning or appeasing, minimizing the self with a bowed head, sometimes laughing to diffuse the energy or the anger of a person we perceive to be threatening us. Sometimes we extend physical touch or a silence when we would otherwise really rather say that we disagree and we want to stand up for ourselves. It's really important to understand that when we are in these zones of being mobilized, being appeasing, or being shut down, when we are there ourselves, we're not able to show up as our best self for providing that thermostat for children and that healthy climate in the classroom. And similarly, if we are, out of our own stress, creating psychologically unsafe environments for our youth, then we're triggering them and their brains and nervous systems into survival mode. And now our best intentions for progressive and productive teaching and learning are not able to take root and flourish in the classroom. And so what do we need to do to help to shift that? As educators and child-serving professionals, it becomes critical for all of us to understand a little bit about what we can do to provide that mind-body regulation for ourselves and to attend to our own self-care and well-being to be that thermostat for youth. And that is centered around us understanding the healing power of the vagus nerve. If you take a look at this chart here, this image shows us the vagus nerve inside the human body. It is called the social engagement nerve. And when it is strong, and when we have something called high vagal tone, we're better able to have improved health, more connected and bonded social engagement, higher access to the learning centers of the brain, and more calm, alert regulation and engagement in our physical bodies. For us continuing to move through this pandemic, an understanding of the techniques that work best for us in creating what we call a personalized menu of self-regulation strategies or vagus nerve activating strategies is more critical than ever. We understand that the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the human body. And you notice that it touched almost every internal organ inside of our physical body. It signals our body to rest and digest. And those of us with higher vagal tone are shown in research to have higher heart rate variability, which leads us to having lower inflammation levels, higher immune system, better heart functioning, lower blood pressure. Higher vagal tone enhances our positive social connections. And most importantly, it opens the pathways of our brains as well as our students' brains for effective healing and learning. It was really exciting for me to begin to teach this work to teachers. And I've shared this work over the last 3 years in a pilot study with a large school district in the state of California. And I just want to share an awareness of what understanding the healing power of the vagus nerve and educators for ourselves, making a commitment to understand what are the things that we have experienced personally that have stressed and challenged our nervous system, that have caused us to live primarily out of survival mode and not in that green zone of calm, relaxed alertness, prepared for healthy social engagement. I know that Pasadena Unified has studied the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study and are aware of trauma-informed teaching practices. And many school districts like you have learned how to look at the trauma that children have experienced as an indicator of whether or not they're ready to learn and whether or not they need extensive supports in order to be able to heal and to come back online for learning. But what I have found is that in many places, Teachers and educators, the child-serving professionals themselves, school counselors, psychologists, aides, have not looked at themselves to understand how has what I've experienced shaped and changed my nervous system, my capacity for calm regulation, and how does the state of my nervous system impact what I do or do not do in my relationships with children, especially of those of us who run classrooms. I'd like to share with you a brief story about a second grade teacher that I worked with in one of the school districts. This is a lovely teacher, a veteran teacher who'd been in the classroom for over 30 years. And I'm working in a professional development setting with teachers, and we're building model brains out of clay. And we're building model nervous systems out of string to help to represent polyvagal theory and our understanding of how our grounded, settled presence supports or disturbs children's well-being. So we're tossing yarn around the room, we're tossing clay so people could get the supplies that they needed. Everyone's having a great time, low stress. We perceived a space of both physical and psychological safety. But this one teacher backed up from the group and became visibly distressed. And when I asked her what we could do to support her, she wasn't ready to speak. And so about 30 minutes later, when we debriefed the exercise and people were talking about what they got out of building the brain from clay and understanding the nervous system with the yarn, she was finally ready to share her experience. Tears were running down her face. And what she said to us was, "Dr. Niki, when we were doing this activity, I didn't feel safe. Everyone laughing, the voices were loud, the yarn being tossed, it felt chaotic to me. And my nervous system, I felt my heart was racing, I'm starting to shake, and I just wanted to get out and run out of the room. Even though I know everyone here was having a good time, I didn't feel good inside. I didn't feel safe inside." And the next part was the thing that changed everything. She said, "But then as I backed up from the activity and I thought about the ACEs test, I thought about childhood trauma, I thought about the things that I've been through, I realized that my ACE score is high," meaning the number of adverse experiences that I experienced in childhood, for those of you who are not aware of the study, is high. And because of that, I need things tight, contained, quiet and still and predictable in order to feel settled. And what I just learned about myself today is that I don't do interactive activities in my classroom. Meaning, what she was saying is, I don't have yarn and clay and children moving about. She said, I give more written, rote work where everyone stays in their seat. Now, think about this. This is a teacher with second graders. A developmentally appropriate way for those of you in early childhood would just automatically assume that a teacher of second graders has manipulatives and activities and arts and supplies all over a second grade classroom. But what she recognized in that moment was that she changes the structure and the discipline requirements of her classroom to create space for her nervous system to feel settled and safe and in control, because she recognized that that was the only time she felt calm. So as the group processed that, we were able to unpack, well, what happens in the classroom for the kids who aren't able to sit still all day long and only work on worksheets and not be able to stand up and move about and be interactive and have manipulative activities and arts? Well, now those were the children who had the behavior problems, and those were the children who were subjected to expulsionary discipline and referrals to the principal's office. And so over the course of the year, we helped that teacher understand what was the trauma-informed therapy that she could seek out for herself. What were the mind-body practices? We taught her the clinical breathwork practice. We taught her mindfulness practices. She started to build what we call a personalized menu of self-regulation strategies, and she committed to them on a daily basis. And as she did that, she found, just like I did when I went through this same process for myself, that my nervous system was able to stay more settled, even in the midst of children doing the exact same things, the same amount of noise, the same amount of movement, the same amount of physical and spatial flux and flow and uncertainty began to disturb her less and less. And as she built the resilience and capacity in her nervous system through various modes of care, in about 6 months, she said, Dr. Niki, it's changing now. Even the principal came and asked, what's happening different in this classroom? Nothing changed for the children, but what changed was a teacher's own understanding of the mind-body practices that would help her begin to settle and heal her own nervous system in ways that made open, interactive classroom activities manageable for her. She was able to maintain a sense of felt safety in the midst of uncertainty and risk and choice for her children. And those same children who used to be kicked out of class or referred for discipline and behavior, over time began to be more and more included and had a different relationship with that teacher. It's also important to note that when we feel stressed, when we feel tired, when we feel dysregulated in any way, it becomes more and more difficult in those times to manage our biases, to operate in alignment with what we know is our higher truth. And so for this teacher, she also began to notice the consistency of which kinds of students, of which types of identities continued to be the ones that were more likely to experience discipline in her classroom, stronger discipline, more exclusionary discipline. And she also began to realize that as she operated from a more settled space, she was able to observe and notice who she called on more often, which students had more attention and affection from her, and which students tended to be more excluded and pushed away from her. So for all of us, having this wider lens of understanding, and I ask you, how has your nervous system and the amount of resilience and the capacity for tolerating risk and uncertainty and dysregulation on the part of students, how has your nervous system been shaped by what you've experienced from your childhood to today? How has your sense of well-being been shaped, not only from what has happened to you from childhood to today, but how has your current state of well-being been shaped by your personal experience through this pandemic? And what will it take for you to commit through this school year to activating the healing power of your vagus nerve and doing the things that could support you increasing your vagal tone the way this teacher did? Her practice was transformed through this understanding. And just 2 years later, her principal acknowledged her by beginning to assign student teachers to her classroom to learn and be mentored by her, where previously that was not on the table for her professionally. So we want to look at this research, not just from Stephen Porges, but from other researchers like Barbara Fredrickson, who have really examined this understanding that compared to people with lower vagal tone, meaning a lower capacity to bounce back from survival mode or states of exceptional stress, people who have higher vagal tone experience more love in their lives and more moments of positive resonance. When we build our vagal tone, we grow a deeper understanding that our nervous systems connect to other people and affect their capacity for self-regulation and optimal functioning. We want to look at understanding that when we do the practices that build our vagal tone, we increase our vocal prosody, which is reflected in the more calming and welcoming tonation of the voice that is more received by the listeners, in this case children, as being non-threatening and welcoming, which signals them to rest and go into parasympathetic and calm down in our presence. We also know that higher vagal tone is reflected in more welcoming and communicative facial expressions that signal a sense of welcome and safety to children who are observing us. When that happens, they're able to calm down and come out of a vigilant state into the parasympathetic mode where they're more relaxed and alert and able to be receptive to learning. We also are conscious of our nonverbal cues, whether our arms are uncrossed and open, whether our hearts and our physical presence is leaning in. And even though during the pandemic we are being encouraged to maintain social distance, it's important that we continue to find ways to show that physical presence and connection with youth, again, to signal that you are safe in my presence, that we are a thermostat that's radiating a temperature of welcome, of unconditional love, acceptance, and hope. So our foundational piece for encouraging you to be on a journey with us around intrapersonal mindfulness this year is centered on this understanding that continues to show up more and more in the current research, which tells us that self-regulation of the adult is the necessary prerequisite for healthy co-regulation for children. And if this is true, then the number one thing that we are all committing to for this year, no matter where we are positioned within this district, either serving children or serving the people who serve children, is this understanding that our transformative leadership and our success this year will depend on our individual willingness to prioritize mindfulness, mindful self-awareness, and well-being. Our goal this year is going to be committing to showing up every day to the best of our ability with a regulated nervous system so that we can serve others without burning out emotionally, physically, or mentally. And when we do that, we'll be the thermostat and not the thermometer. I'd like to share with you just a few of the self-regulation strategies that we're beginning to see in the research. And these are timeless practices that have been known since the beginning across all cultures that help us increase vagal tone. This is all in addition to understanding that for some of us, these holistic practices won't be enough for what we've been through. And I want to reiterate before I even begin to share this list that if a trauma-informed licensed mental health practitioner is the best line of support for you to achieve the state of well-being that we're referring to here that will allow you to truly be a healing presence for youth, please give yourself permission and the time to seek out that support. Alongside of it, for some of us, self-regulation strategies from a holistic perspective will be enough. For some of us, it'll be a combination of the two. The invitation for you this year is to find your truth and to live it out in full. Research shows us that of all the practices that you see listed here, that voluntarily regulated breathing practices, which I'll be sharing with many of you at your school sites this year, is the fastest way to shift the state of the nervous system and to bring the body into a state of calm, alert relaxation. Prayer and mindfulness practices are also being shown to increase vagal tone. Human touch and connection is something that many of us have not gotten enough of in this pandemic, where we would normally hug and be in close proximity to those we love. So finding ways to self-soothe, what we call shoulder sweeps, are effective ways to begin to self-massage, to bring those oxytocin boosts from being able to support and affirm and soothe ourselves in times where we cannot touch others. Visualization, things that generate compassion and gratitude, whether they be journaled or acts of kindness and loving kindness, boost vagal tone. Anything that vibrates at the throat, laughter, singing, chanting, gargling, humming, all of these you may find are instinctive things that you may have done during times of stress to help yourself soothe and settle down. Magnesium helps to calm the nervous system. I enjoy finding that with Epsom salt baths. And I'll throw essential oils like bergamot or geranium. You may enjoy lavender or other essential oils that support calm. Any form of yoga, exercise, golf, fishing, sewing, gardening. So many of us have preferred hobbies and physical activities that we are aware bring us down into that state of calm that allows us to show up as the thermostat. And it's also important to note that for all of us, restoring our deep connection to nature is critical for balancing our nervous system, our heart, and our brains, and bringing regulation to our bodies as a whole. Whether or not we're able to take a faraway vacation during this time, we are blessed to live in California, where in just a few hours, we can be at the ocean, in the desert, in the mountains, in the forest, in the park, any place that allows us to disconnect from our world and to touch down into the natural environment and to settle our nervous systems. Before I say goodbye, I'd like to share with you my personal favorite on this list of self-regulation strategies. I find the most effective way to help bring me out of a mobilized state and back into that parasympathetic state of higher vagal tone is through voluntarily regulated breathing practices. Now, I am someone who has suffered from asthma, And what I've learned as a certified clinical breathwork instructor is that many people who have higher rates of stress, higher exposure to trauma, as well as those of us who have respiratory conditions like asthma, tend to be what we call vertical or shoulder breathers, meaning we inhale and suck the belly in and breathe up and high into the shoulders. Simply learning to bring the breath out of the shoulders and the upper chest and to bring the breath through the nose, through the diaphragm, and through the belly changed my life and made it possible for me to go on to this longer journey of understanding the science of breath and applying other types of breath that have really helped me and many others to regulate. So what I'd like you to do right now is just take a moment to take a deep breath in and notice. When you breathe in, do you find yourself inhaling up and through the shoulders, high into the shoulders? Or when you breathe in, do you notice that your belly expands, the shoulders stay down and relaxed? So if you breathe in, you would be called a horizontal breather. And that is considered an anxiety-producing breath pattern that moves away from high vagal tone and parasympathetic activation. However, if you can breathe in and out through the nose, breathe in through the belly and let the belly expand. Breathe out through the nose. Let the belly button fall in toward your spine. Diaphragmatic breathing, breath in and out through the nose. Belly expands as you breathe in. Belly falls in toward the spine as you breathe out. That is just the first introduction, one powerful technique that you could apply today that could change the breath, which in turn changes our mental and emotional state. And if you could do just one thing this year that would allow you to improve and increase your vagal tone, allowing you to be the thermostat that creates a welcoming climate and environment for all the students we serve in this district, it would be to ground the breath. Choose something from this self-regulation strategy menu, implement it on a daily basis, and make your self-care non-negotiable. For many people, I find, especially child-serving professionals, we say self-care feels selfish, Dr. Niki. When I take the time to do breath work, when I take the time to do mindfulness practices, when I take the time to garden or to hike or to go to the beach, I feel like I'm not serving youth or I'm not doing my job. So I leave you with this message. Self-care is not selfish. Self-care does two things. Self-care creates space in our minds and in our hearts for new solutions to emerge. And we are facing conditions that require new breakthrough solutions and not a rehashing of what we've done in the past. And the second thing that self-care does, and this commitment that we would make today, self-care creates space and strategies for us to keep the pain of life from accumulating. Because what happens, we think we're stuffing it down. We think we're holding it together. But that pain of life is oozing through our nervous systems out into the space, creating unintended harm for those we serve. So we make a commitment to practice these self-care practices so that the best of us shows up so that we can provide healing-centered engagement for the children we serve, be the thermostat and not the thermometer, and support each other with healing-centered engagement in Pasadena, and it will ripple beyond. I can't wait to meet so many of you this year in professional development opportunities, and I just thank you for this opportunity to inspire you to commit to high vagal tone and to being the thermostat and not the thermometer.